Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world, even in the time of the coronavirus, with me, George Galloway. All alone, stripped down, wartime conditions. Gayatri's not with me, of course, on account of her pregnancy. Now, we're in the time of a pandemic. Pandemic means across the world, but nowhere, I suspect, is going to be more badly hit than the United States of America. So quickly over there right now with the star of the show, the man I used to run around with here in London and whom we all greatly miss, formerly of this parish, host of the Keiser Report and many other things. It's the one and only Max Keiser. Max, welcome back onto the Sputnik. So wonderful to see you with so many books for you to read during lockdown. Tell us first, just to, because our readers have an inexhaustible interest in you and Stacey, how are you spending your time?
Oh, I'm perfecting my baking skills. I'm making lots of pies and cakes and doing lots of reading. But you know, George, it's like the whole world suddenly was caught being very, very naughty, and we've all been sent to our room to think about what we've done. I mean, think about the world economy was entered into this neoliberal multi-decade experiment of fiat currencies. It all has blown up horribly now, and we're all paying the price. And I think you're right that the US is probably one country that is the least prepared for a pandemic. If you think about the economy the last few decades, it's all about instant gratification, just in time supply chains. And when all that comes crashing down in a heartbeat, no country is more ill-prepared than the U.S. And you see it here, George, on the ground. People are still in disbelief that they can't get what they want when they want it, whenever, at whatever cost. And so it's a bit of a reality shock, George.
Yes, shock absorbers. We've run into them. You're ill-prepared on the political level too, aren't you? Because the Republican Party is led by a man who is increasingly unhinged, at least at the podium, and the Democratic Party is led by its putative presidential candidate who can't be let out alone, and even under controlled conditions in his increasingly, well, disturbing videos, doesn't seem to know where he is or what time of day it is or what he's even running for. Is anyone emerging from the pack as an alternative leader to these two?
Not really, George. In America, both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, are dominated by corporations and corporate donors. And since the end of World War II, there's been a drift toward a pure corpocracy, government by and for corporations. Corporations have human rights now, and everything is for and about corporations and the people who run the corporations. On the Republican side, Donald Trump, I think, has finally met his match with this coronavirus, because when we report, as we did just this week, that the unemployment rate in America went from what would normally be maybe 200,000 to suddenly 3.2 million, that's a shock to the system. It's now estimated that the unemployment rate in America will exceed that of the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, it got to 25%. Estimates now are unemployment to get to 30%. So I don't envy any president sitting in the White House right now dealing with that. On the Democratic side, you're quite right. Joe Biden appears to be having some severe health issues. The thinking here is that he's just a placeholder, and that when they get into the Democratic convention, there's going to be a sudden parachuting in of Hillary Clinton, who's going to save the day, and there's going to end up the nominee for the Democratic Party, George.
Now, of course, the 1930s only ended for us in the 1930s with Second World War, ended a little bit later for you, ended with the election of FDR, picking America up out of the Great Depression. What would pick America up from a new Great Depression?
That's an interesting question, George. I don't think we're going to see a similar picking up from a depression into a rebirth of the American economy. I think what we're seeing now is the green light for the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, working with central banks around the world to effectively take the stock market and all the businesses that are associated with the stock market, the bond market, private. And so that the public markets, the publicly listed exchanges where all these stocks and bonds are listed, they are flooding these markets with what they call infinite quantitative easing, infinite amounts of money. And these huge corporations, these multi-trillion-dollar, these trillion-dollar corporations like, Amazon, Google, Alphabet, Apple, are simply going to use that free money to buy back their own stock, buy back all their competitors, and it's going to be turned into a true kind of oligopoly in America with very few players. And I think that the end result politically would be akin to feudalism. I call it neo-feudalism. There's going to be the private equity oligarchs at the top, and the vast majority of Americans will be living hand to mouth.
Now, how are the American people facing this onslaught? Are they bunkering down in the cities, or are they fleeing the cities?
Well, that's a good question. There's definitely people who are fleeing the cities. So they're going from New York and they're going into the countryside. We know in North Carolina, there's a lot of displaced New Yorkers that are showing up, and they're bringing potentially the virus with them. So they're not welcome here. And they're also leaving where there could be a much better health solution for them. The hospitals in New York are probably more prepared than the smaller regional and villages where they have much smaller medical facilities. That could be a big shock when they're denied service and denied health care and told to go back to New York, which could be a very interesting situation. As far as the majority of Americans, America has a brilliant ability to improvise. This is the home of jazz. After all, we invented jazz here in America, and Americans are brilliant at improvising and coming up with ways to solve problems, and necessity is the mother of invention. And Americans are very proud in their ability to overcome hardships and obstacles in innovative, interesting ways.
And a search for alternative media like ours, I'm sure you are experiencing, as I am, a gigantic leap in audience. As people tire of the orthodox media because they simply no longer trust it.
I think that the need for the mainstream media to scramble to find ways to broadcast, and broadcasting from home, for example, it makes them look exactly like alternative media, which has been broadcasting from home for years. So now people are just making an oranges to oranges comparison and saying, well, actually, which content is better now that they actually look the same? And they're saying, well, this alt media that's been around for so long is actually much richer in content. I know the Keiser report, our view numbers on YouTube have doubled and tripled. We're getting 150,000, 250,000 views on our dubbed Spanish version of the Keiser report suddenly. And so because what we've been saying for 10 years, George, we've been a guest on your show for years, and we've been saying for 10 years that the debt bubble has got to blow up at some point, that gold and silver are going to come back into fashion when fiat money collapses, that the ability to print money to infinity is not being glib. It's an actual statement of policy. And so this is all coming out, and people are saying, you know what, Kaiser, Stacy, I've been saying this for years. I'm going to go back to where I started because they were actually on target.
Tell me about gold, Max. You've been talking to me about gold and silver for a decade. I heard today that actually there's no gold left. People are still buying gold, but actually on the principle that if you don't hold it, you don't own it. They're not actually going to hold it because it doesn't exist. What's happening in the gold market?
Right. Well, actually, I was a guest of yours at an event in Parliament a few years ago, and I spoke at length on this gold market. And it was people were standing in the rain for hours to get into that event. George, we should do another event together. Maybe come over to America once this pandemic cools down. But anyway, talking about gold, the problem or the issue with gold is that it's the flip side of what we've been talking about in terms of financialization. So the neoliberal model, the Washington consensus, has always been about going to fiat money and derivatives and building up debt for decades after decade and getting the central bank to bail you out whenever you make a mistake. That can only work if concurrently the price of gold is suppressed. If the price of gold is kept from vaulting forward, because the price of gold would start to reflect the fact that the government policymakers and the central banks are printing trillions of dollars. That's inflationary. If they can keep the price of gold cheap, then it doesn't reflect what they're doing to destroy the economy. What's happened now with this sudden surge of a need for hard money to protect against the money printing, there's a rush into gold, and people are finding out that these exchanges like the London Bullion Market Association or the COMEX in New York are actually been selling paper gold and not the actual physical real gold itself. And people are, when they ask to take delivery of this gold, the actual physical gold, after years and years of being satisfied with just paper, they're being told, wait a minute, we don't actually have that gold. It doesn't exist. We've been selling you paper gold. The physical gold, we haven't had it for years.
Paper gold.
Excuse me?
Paper gold.
A paper gold would be a futures contract.
Yeah.
Would be, you are trading, like, for example, in the oil market, for every barrel of oil, there are 60,000 barrels of paper barrels of oil. For every ounce of gold, there are thousands of ounces of paper gold, of futures contracts, of derivatives, people buying and selling what they think is gold. As long as nobody takes physical delivery, then the game, it's exactly Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff was caught finally as a Ponzi scheme because he was selling stuff that didn't exist. This is true of the gold market and the paper gold market. They've been selling gold that only exists in somebody's ledger, in somebody's accounting book. It doesn't actually exist in the vault. And so now when people want it because of an event like we're having now, where the fiat money world is collapsing, the bullion banks, those banks that are responsible for maintaining the global supply of gold, have been lying for years, and they have to say, well, actually, we don't have the gold. So when you go to buy it, it's not there, or the price is considerably higher. And ironically, George, what this means is that if enough people try to demand to get physical gold and are unable to get it, they're going to go to that only other source of hard money available to them today, and that would be Bitcoin. And so the shortage of physical gold could be the ultimate driver of demand for Bitcoin, which is exactly what those of us, like we've been saying on Keiser Report for years, have been saying. It is a gold substitute, and I think that'll be a hugely important market phenomenon this year.
Well, there you go. Our economy is all wrapped up in silver paper, but there ain't no silver underneath. Your pies are ready. Go and take them out the oven. The legend that is Max Keiser. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Anytime, George.
Coming up after the break, another legend, the legendary Australian academic, author and campaigner, Tim Anderson. Don't miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. Now, it's absolutely clear that the United States is using the time of corona to intensify their regime change operations, particularly in Venezuela, even more particularly in the case of Iran. Earlier, I caught up with the legendary Australian academic, author and campaigner Tim Anderson, and I asked him, leaving aside the morality of that, is it going to work on the ground?
Yes, you're right, George. The US, of course, has been trying to isolate and break Iran for 40 years, pretty much, more than 40 years. And they've doubled down on their sanctions during this coronavirus crisis to make it more difficult for the public health system in Iran to get along. Now, they have quite a robust public health system, but of course, like everyone else, they do depend on getting in certain outside drugs and certain outside services, so the US is making it much more difficult for Iran, which has one of the worst crises at the moment, to deal with that.
In a way, it's the second or third worst in the world, and yet Pompeo this week announced an increase in sanctions. From your long experience of these things, how is that likely to play down on the streets of Iran? Is that going to make regime change more or less likely? I'm thinking, for example, of the Cuban example. More than 40 years under sanctions, yet still standing tall and quite prominent in this crisis.
Well, it doesn't endear the Americans to the Iranian people, that's one thing, but of course it depends on the Iranian government and how they look after their people, and they have got a very good track record, by the way. If we go to an independent source, the UNDP, we'll see that human development in Iran is second only to China in the last 3 decades. So there have been enormous improvements in health and education, for example. But that I don't think really matters to Washington, because their approach to sanctions, as they did with Cuba, as they've done with a number of other countries, is to try and tighten the screws and make the system scream and make people desperate.
I was just looking back at a debate I did a year ago in which the supporters of empire endlessly prattled about a rules-based order. I thought at the time a year ago it was a tad hypocritical, but as you put it, the people who shout loudest about the rules-based order are the people who break all the existing rules.
Yeah, this is something that is bringing to a head a lot of the contradictions of what used to be called a neoliberal system, with a lot of ideas about free markets and open markets. But we have a world full of sanctions and economic blockades, the most illiberal system you could imagine. I think it's rather a symptom of the fact that the empire is in decline, and it's a bit more dangerous in those sort of circumstances. It's trying all sorts of things to maintain its supremacy, maintain its technological supremacy over China.
One of our soldiers lost her life this week in a camp in Iraq. I think at least 2 American forces also died. The United States is under increasing attack for its presence in Iraq, which may itself be illegal because of the decision of the Iraqi parliament to ask the foreign armies to leave. That's debatable because there's a question of the powers of the president and the prime minister and the parliament and so on. But legal or not legal, the presence of foreign forces in Iraq is also now looking distinctly shaky.
Yes, it is, and they're being made. It's being made clear to them that they're not welcome. There's been a lot of low-level attacks on US bases, most recently that one north of Baghdad you mentioned. I believe in recent days also there have been moves for the US troops to move out of Khaimah, which is one of the border towns, up towards Hasaka in Syria. So a couple of the border points have been very sensitive for the US because they've been also trying to prevent a coordination between the Syrian and the Iraqi armies. But apparently they're surrendering the Khaimah camp to the Iraqi military.
This, I mean, if the whole Iraq invasion was about demonstrating to the world the hegemony of the United States, its overwhelming dominant power, it hasn't worked really, has it?
No, and of course earlier this year they did a great deal of damage with the assassination of the commanders Soleimani and Mohandes, and that unified the Iraqi people more than anything.
Now, what about Syria, which is the subject of one of your magnificent books, The Dirty War on Syria? Well, tell us first why you call it a dirty war.
I think because my experience had been in Latin America, where the phrase was used, that they were using the Contras against Nicaragua, for example, and they were doing secret assassinations in Operation Condor in the south. There was a whole history of those sorts of wars. And what bothered me about Syria was that very few in the Western left liberal anti-war movement really rallied to it. They were sucked in by this idea that it was a humanitarian intervention, as in the case of Libya. And so with Syria, there's been a massive scale of propaganda about what is really going on there, the demonisation of the government, the Syrian army and so on, the constant claims that they are targeting children in hospitals, these sorts of things. Sheer war propaganda, but nevertheless the reaction from the internationalism in the West was very, very muted for a long time. I think it's grown a bit, but it's still in a minority.
The use of proxies automatically entails dirtiness, doesn't it? Because if you're not yourself, as a democracy, held to some sort of account by your people, engaging in a war, but rather are enabling others to do so, however dirty those are, and some of our allies in the Syrian proxy war have filmed themselves cutting off children's heads and executing priests and so on. It follows, doesn't it, ineluctably, that if you're not yourself engaged in the war, and things can go wrong even then, but you're paying, arming, propagandizing for other allies, dirtiness is an axiom, isn't it?
Yes, I agree. But I think also there's another word for it, which is really coined by the liberal side of US politics, which is called smart power, that they are going to use those proxies, they're going to use propaganda, they're going to use all sorts of irregular warfare, which will reduce the cost. They'll get other parties to pay for it. And so that's something that was a really great innovation on the liberal side of politics. Once upon a time we thought the Conservatives were the hawks and the Liberals were more diplomatic people. I think that's been reversed in the 21st century, and that smart power coincides with what you were just describing, I think.
Well, actually, again, you raise an interesting point that I've been thinking about quite a lot in relation to Trump versus the Democrats. Hillary Clinton, in a way, personifies the liberal love of war. She even laughs about it. We came, we saw, he died. Ha ha ha, she said of Libya. It is odd, isn't it, how left and right have changed places?
I think it is, and I think the innovators in imperial war have been that liberal wing. I mean, if we go back farther to the 19th century, we'll see, for example, in the English tradition, John Stuart Mill, who's known for his writings on freedom, but was also a great supporter of empire. So there was a very strong liberal tradition supporting empire and having this view of the world of, inconsistent with today's world of international law and state sovereignty and so on.
Another of your books, Axis of Resistance, talks about how, whether they liked it or not, or wanted it or not, again, I come back to Cuba. It was not the intention of the Cuban leaders to become, as it were, a part of the Soviet sphere of influence. They were pushed into that. This axis, I don't like the word axis, it has terrible resonance here in the English-speaking world. The Axis were who we fought in the Second World War, but they've all been pushed together, haven't they? All those picked on by empire end up, therefore, in the same camp.
There's been a great obsession to divide and rule the people of the Middle East, of West Asia, and the constant efforts to divide Iran from Iraq, for example, beginning with the terrible war in the 80s. But as you say, the result of that constant division has been that they're coming together. Really, the big obsession with Iran, coming from Tel Aviv, coming from Washington, is precisely because Iran is supporting the resistance in Palestine, it's supporting the resistance in Lebanon, it's supporting the resistance in Syria and Yemen and Iraq. And so it's right, they've created their own monster in a way. They're helping bring together the peoples of the region in a way that may have been difficult had they not been under that sort of attack.
Now, as we speak, economies are closing down. America is officially in recession, according to the Bank of America today. We are going to experience here in Britain a very substantial fall in output and inevitably recession. Recession could even become depression. On the economic front and on the geopolitical front, are these the last days of empire?
Well, it's bold to say those sorts of things, isn't it? Because systems have crises constantly, but I think for a new system to emerge out of this, it has to be built by people. They have to create new systems. People used to say that capitalism was subject to these crises and something new would come out of it. I believe rather that people have to construct new realities out of these sorts of crises, and it depends on organisation.
And are they going to? Or is it going to be business as usual come the autumn?
I don't think it's going to be business as usual. As you say, the economic outlook is very bleak at the moment with all around the world these sorts of restrictions, and which are precisely closing down economies all around the world. The illiberal nature of international relations, all of the wars in the Middle East, the various conflicts in Latin America also. There's an enormous illiberal atmosphere in recent years, and I think the current corona crisis is going to add to that.
Best of luck on your tour and stay healthy.
Thanks very much.
Tim Anderson, we need you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Well, alas, that brings us to the end of the show, but you can still stay in touch with us through social media. But most importantly, come back next week at the same time, in the same place, and bring someone else with you. It's been marvellous.